the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Marina Itron, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. So, Tim, long time no see. I briefly saw you at our gala dinner last week. So, how are you doing?
I am great. We were like two passing ships in the night.
That's right. It was a busy night.
Yes, but it was, I knew it would be a fantastic program and a fascinating discussion. And Dr. Laffer certainly delivered. He was funny and insightful and very engaging with all of the guests. And he's a very personable guy. I think he talked to just about everybody there, during the course of the evening. I thought it was what a great evening for our Thatcher Gala. What did you think?
Oh, I thought it was terrific. And he really just dazzled our audience, I have to say. Everyone knows he's a brilliant economist. He has so many facts at his fingertips and able to articulate them. And why he's so great is that he's able to take very complicated economic theories and concepts and without dumbing it down, explain it to the audience. We had him this time because he's got a new book out, and the book is called Taxes Have Consequences, and it focuses on the demonized top 1% of tax filers. You liberals and the media love to put down and say that they are, not paying their, quote, fair share. So Dr. Laffer looks at what happens to tax revenue when you raise taxes on the top 1%. They fall. And the bottom line, and he has evidence to show it, when the top 1% pay less taxes and low income taxpayers, what he puts it, they get creamed. And this is because the economy loses its vibrancy. The top 1%, they're able to hide their revenue. And overall, it generates fewer jobs. And the working class gets hit the hardest. He also talked about outmigration. And this is a theme that he's been in a study that he's been working on for a long time, following the migration patterns of high tax states and low tax states, blue states versus red states. And unfortunately, he thinks that it's going to continue over the next few years until the blue states like ours start to lower taxes and deregulate, when we can start to bring Californians back to the state.
Of course, one of the other highlights for me of the evening was we awarded our Baroness Thatcher Award to our chairman, Clark Judge, and our Ro is being very modest. She, for me, was the highlight of the evening with her great tribute to Clark. And listening to your speech, Ro, I thought, there's someone who's been a speechwriter.
Oh, thanks, Tim. I felt like I had to kind of deliver, having so many speechwriters in the audience like yourself, writing for Arnold Schwarzenegger when he was governor, and so many of the leadership in the legislature, and Lance, who is a former speechwriter to Ed Meese, and then, of course, Clark Judge, who was a presidential speechwriter. We even had Ken Kachigan in the audience, who was also the chief speechwriter to Ronald Reagan. Yes, I had to be on my A game just because I knew you guys were out there listening, but thank you very much. But Clark's really been our chairman. He's really been a great chairman for us, and we were so pleased to honor him. But Tim, you've been holding down the fort. The big news is that the May revised budget is out, but so is the latest budget deficit, which is now up to $32 billion. So listeners probably know that California by law needs to have a balanced budget. So you've been following this issue and where the cuts could potentially be made.
It's literally, I woke up early Friday morning in my hotel room going through all of what we were learning about the governor's budget announcement. So that's right. The shortfall has grown by about $9.3 billion to $31.5 billion. And, we're in kind of even more uncertain times, right? Because we're on the brink of a recession, certainly. But also look at all the debate in Washington over the debt ceiling. It's pretty clear we're not going to be able to get any money from Washington to help us with our budget problems. And Washington could claw some of that money back in this debate over the debt ceiling. So to break it down, the governor proposed $6.7 billion in spending cuts and pullbacks, meaning, from existing spending. He's proposed about $3.9 billion in trigger cuts. So that's cuts that will materialize if the revenue isn't there. He has about $8.8 $2.1 billion in spending delays. So that's kind of kicking the can down the road to next year, and has about $7.5 billion in fund shifts. So we're paying for Program X, borrowing out of some other fund. And, in talking with our Wayne Weingarten about this, Wayne makes the case that, ironically, the governor is being the grown-up in the room on this one. And Wayne has made the case that Governor Newsom is channeling his inner Jerry Brown, because Jerry Brown was famous for, kind of, even though known as, a very lefty politician, he didn't go for a lot of silliness. And he came in, if you remember the last time, in a time of, after one of the, if not the biggest, financial crisis the state has faced. And he put the state back on track with, a focus on cutting debt and living within our means and spending one-time money for one-time purposes. And Newsom is not as strict about it as Brown was, but he certainly is kind of heading down that path. And then you see the contrast with what Democrats in the Senate are proposing. They want to have a massive new $7.2 billion tax hike on employers. They want to create a new $10 billion housing and infrastructure fund. And those are things that, the governor has rejected out of hand. Then you also see Democrats in the Assembly where they're not as far out there as the Senate, but they're talking about wanting to tap into the rainy day fund reserve to avoid a lot of these cuts. And the governor has also rejected that move out of hand because, we're not in a recession yet, technically. If we raid that money now, when, yes, it might not be a pleasant budget, but it's a manageable budget, we're not going to have that that money saved away potentially next year when we might have a real budget crisis on our hands. So kudos to the governor for kind of the path he wants to take the state down in the budget this year. Now the real debate begins, and we'll all see in about a month from now who wins, the governor or the legislature.
So, Tim, how do you think the governor's political aspirations fits into all this?
Well, I think it's pretty clear, governors always want to be able to tick that box. I held the line on spending. I cut taxes, or I rejected tax increases. I grew the economy. I created jobs. I, did all of these other things. And even when you're a liberal governor, you want to do that. And Newsom, it seems like it wants to position himself by saying, I've done all these tough things fiscally, but I've also governed as a progressive, and I've created this program and spent this amount. So I think that's where he's trying to position himself, that I'm a budget balancer, but I'm also, a progressive in my budget values.
Well said. So how about introducing our next guest?
Well, another thing that happened last week in a very busy week was President Biden unveiled the latest incarnation of the Clean Power Plan, which, if you remember from back in the Obama days, and PRI did a landmark national study on this issue, it's really an effort to target power plant emissions. And of course, the Obama administration and now the Biden administration, are proposing to do so in a way that is, they're additional costly green mandates on energy producers that are going to increase people's electric bills, make energy less reliable, and have a lot of, hugely negative impacts on individuals, businesses, and the economy. And so the Buckeye Institute, our sister think tank in Ohio, they've just released a new study, compares, what the impact of this plan would be on ratepayers in California. And they also study in their home state of Ohio what the impact would be on ratepayers there. And it really is an example of, California has been there, done that. And these kinds of bad ideas that we've had from California are being exported east by the Biden administration and governors and in other states. So Ohio has actually a relatively free market energy policy, and they've done a lot more effective job in addressing emissions than California has with our big government mandates. So we chat with Rea Hederman from the Buckeye Institute, who has this terrific new study out, and he and Wayne also have a joint op-ed on this issue that was just published this week in the Orange County Register. So it's a very timely and interesting issue, and certainly is another costly green mandate that is going to increase energy burdens for so many millions of Californians and people across the country.
Thanks, everyone, for listening.
Ray, welcome to Next Round Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So we're so happy to have you on to discuss your very timely new research on how a revived clean power plan would impact consumers in California and Ohio. Now, our listeners may remember that the Clean Power Plan was originally proposed back in the Obama administration, but there was quite a lot of legal and political maneuvering on the plan from the moment it was announced. So maybe you could bring us up to speed. How did we get to where we are today, facing a potential second incarnation of the Clean Power Plan?
Yeah, Tim, thanks for asking. So the original Clean Power Plan, as you mentioned, started with Barack Obama's administration, where they attempted to move it through Congress. And when people looked at kind of the cost and impact it would have on families and businesses, they realized that they were not going to be successful to implement that. And since then, Democratic administrations have tried to use the powers of the administrative state through regulations to achieve some of the end goals of the Clean Power Plan. And recently, we saw a Supreme Court decision when a whole bunch of states, led by West Virginia, successfully sued to block a lot of these environmental rules. Well, really, people thought that maybe this could be the end of the road, but it turns out, it was just the halfway point, because we're seeing new rules being promulgated by the Biden administration. These are proposals coming out of the Environmental Protection Agency, primarily, as well as other regulatory bodies. And unlike the original Clean Power Plan, which was kind of a massive behemoth piece of regulation and an attempt at legislation, now what we're seeing is the Biden administration is trying to break up the Clean Power Plan for specifically target certain aspects of regulations to still get at the end goal, which is moving us from our traditional energy sources to alternative fuels, is doing away with gas-powered cars, and really trying to rein in anything that might affect greenhouse gas emissions. And they're trying to do this rifle shot approach so they can stop losing in court, given the precedent the Supreme Court has said. So we expect that the EPA and more rules in the Biden administration will be coming down probably as soon as May of 2023, or maybe next month in June.
Well, that actually led into, I guess, my first question. As the Biden administration is going all in on the Clean Power Plan Part 2, could you kind of dive into some of those specific details for our listeners of, in particular, what exactly is the Biden administration trying to propose this time around?
Yeah, so unlike the previous Clean Power Plans that really went off only on certain aspects of traditional energy sources, the first aspect is they want to regulate new natural gas plants and basically, again, try to go after carbon emissions and force them to institute new types of technology dealing with carbon capture. This is in addition to some of the regulations they're also trying to impose on coal plants as well. So again, you have them expanding to more bold regulations aimed at the natural gas plants, which were not subject to the same level of regulations that coal was. And the problem is, one of the ways they want to go about it is, forcing companies to basically either shift their energy sources or to really utilize a lot of carbon capture technology. And carbon capture technology is really not been an effectively proven technique for constraining greenhouse gases. So, the end result will be forcing a lot of utilities to change where they're going to get their source of energy from, diversify away from cheaper forms of fuel like natural gas or coal, to try to get to these new regulations. The second thing, I talked about rifle shots, so that kind of hits the utility industry. Well, it's been in the news that very quickly the Biden administration wants to limit the sale of gas-powered automobiles. Individual states, such as unfortunately yours, are talking about the complete elimination of the sale of gas-powered cars within the next decade. So, the Biden administration has said that we're going to regulate the number number of electric vehicles that must be sold. And so, it kind of reminds me of the old Ronald Reagan quote, if it moves, tax it. If it keeps moving, regulate it. And if it dies, subsidize it. And that's what we're seeing with the electric car market. We're seeing a regulatory burden on basically what type of vehicles now must be electric, how many of the new car sales must be electric and be produced by manufacturers. And of course, to get around the fact that electric vehicles are extremely expensive, we see a massive amount of government subsidies going towards both car makers and then going to end users, buyers. So you have that weird point of today's politics where Democrats are in favor of subsidies of people making close to $100,000 so they can afford an $80,000 car, a nice electric Tesla. So those are some of the specific regulatory pieces that the Biden administration are trying to put together to add up to the overall goal of the original Clean Power Plan. One of the big differences, the first one was much more looking at kind of cap and trade. And this looks to be more like direct regulations on how companies can sell products, how power companies can produce power, and what type of fuel sources they can use to give energy to their customers.
So back in 2016, PRI produced a county-by-county analysis across the whole country of how the original Clean Power Plan would have impacted electricity costs. And at the time, our research showed that we would see many more Americans falling into what we call energy poverty, or when you have to spend more than 10% of your income paying for electricity. So based on your research, just how much more could Californians be paying for electricity if Clean Power Plan Part 2 becomes reality?
Yeah, so it depends a little bit on where they're located in California. So, we've broken up our research into looking at some urban areas, versus some rural areas. And what we found is, some people are going to be spending anywhere from about $600 to closer to $1,000 more each year due to higher energy costs. And this is because utility plants are going to have to pay more to produce each kilowatt of energy. And when these companies are having to pay more to produce energy, of course, that cost is going to be passed on to consumers. And that's why, Californians are going to be paying up to $1,000 more each year because of these energy mandates.
Aren't these energy mandates, thinking about the original Clean Power Plan compared to what seems to be coming out, the fact that there's more mandates on specific types, in a way, you could say this is even worse than the original.
Yes, because, Wayne, I think it is because people will feel it more directly, because the idea that you're now not going to be allowed to purchase a gas-powered vehicle, which is a much cheaper vehicle to produce and obviously to buy than an electric vehicle, for example. That is a very big difference that did not exist 10 years ago. And then you see a lot more of these more intrusive mandates, banning gas stoves is another example, a basic where you're seeing government regulators at both in that case, both the local, state, and potentially federal level going after goods that everyday Americans purchase for their own personal use. That is a very different approach than original Clean Power Plan, that had the complicated carbon tax credit swaps, between states, between industries. This plan is more broad reaching in the sense that some of the rules are going to be reaching into every aspect of Americans' life, from anywhere from how you cook to heat your house to how you drive to work or to the supermarket.
It's funny you say that because we're already doing that here in California, where we're already on that path. Like we like to say, we've been there, done that when it comes to all these different green mandates. We're already pushing our 100% renewable energy mandates, and we're outlawing the sale of gas-powered cars, and gas stoves are next, and water heaters. And our research has shown that when you kind of collectively impose all of these new burdens, that it's the communities that can at least afford them that are really harmed the most. And we found that Californians could save about $2,000 a year if we eliminated all of our unrealistic and expensive green policies. What does your research show about how this second clean power plan could add to economic burdens, particularly for low income and minority communities?
Yeah. So to put kind of the cost of impact on Californians, we looked at it in terms of what are the everyday goods people buy. And we found that, for Californians of average or below average income, you're talking about losing about 2 months worth of groceries just to maintain their current energy consumption. And so that becomes a real trade-off for a lot of these communities, some of which are living on fixed income. We know that retirees tend to be of the lower income. These are people on Social Security. A lot of times they have their houses paid, but they're on fixed incomes to get a certain amount of cash each month through retirement programs. When their energy costs go up, these are going to be the people that are more going to be likely to fall into energy poverty because energy costs will eat such a higher proportion of their fixed income amount each month.
So as we learned from the first go around, a second clean power plan, of course, would have enormously negative consequences for our economy at a time when we're teetering on the verge of recession. So what did your research find about the plan's potential impact on California's economy?
Yes. So California, in some ways, because you guys have been further down the bad road and you have a lot of natural advantages, fares better than some states. But faring better just means it's less bad. What we find is that the California GDP is going to fall somewhere between $5 to $7 billion annually. People are going to be spending about $2 to $2.5 billion less every year. You're going to see a decline in tax revenues about $2 billion. So even as you attempt to subsidize green energy, you're going to be losing tax revenue because consumers are going to be worse off and purchasing less. Investment's going to drop about $4 billion. And overall, again, the total California economy is going to take a hit of about $5 to $7 billion all in by the end of the next decade. So it is a pretty significant economic burden to put not just on everyday households, but to the state of California, because businesses are going to have to pay more for their energy costs to operate. Manufacturing is about 13% of the California economy, somewhere 11 to 13% in the most recent data. And energy is one of the higher input goods in manufacturing because it takes a lot of energy to run an assembly line, to produce chips, for example. And so when these companies are paying this much more for energy, well, obviously that's going to impact their ability to hire new workers, to expand their business, or even to look at, starting a new product line and continue to innovate.
Another issue that seems to arise when we're talking about this transition that at the federal level, in a bureaucrat's office, right? It's very easy. You draw on the whiteboard and you can have a new solar power plant or new wind generator, but it's a lot more complicated than that. You need an entirely new transmission infrastructure. You need all sorts of storage. And if we don't, then we're not going to be able to have an electricity grid that provides the electricity that people need on demand. And that's really the key to a reliable grid is we need to be able to generate enough electricity and it needs to do it on demand. Well, if we have all of these complications in terms of creating the infrastructure for solar and wind, and we're at the same time putting all of these new demand on the energy grid itself, aren't we creating a huge shortage of electricity that's going to be impacting us in the not so distant future?
Absolutely, Wayne. I think, you guys have experienced that more, than we have, where due to high energy demand and insufficient supply, you guys have price spikes, you have rolling blackouts. And that can very much be the wave of the future because, we have storage problems. So when the sun is not shining at night, what's going to happen to places that run 3-line shifts in certain areas with manufacturing that still runs during the night, but that energy source isn't needed. We know certain states that have, again, like California, that have shifted to more renewables. import a lot of energy from other states. Well, if every state is now having to abide by these regulations and can no longer produce the same amount of energy from our existing natural gas facilities, well, we will definitely be looking at widespread energy shortages, and not just, in California, Pacific, or not just during periods of peak usage like winter, but it could very much be an everyday occurrence because, when, as you mentioned, we have a very, very aggressive timeline that politicians and President Biden has promised to shift to these renewables. And technology is not there. And there's a big question about whether or not we can build out these plants in time to meet those deadlines. For example, we have seen proposed green energy plants delayed, ironically, by environmental lawsuits. So our supply is simply not going to be sufficient to meet the demands if we start eliminating our more reliable energy sources. Right now, a lot of states have been able to utilize reliable energy sources by purchasing it, from another state. But if that option goes away, then I think a lot of politicians and state regulators are going to have to figure out how to deal with energy shortages because our energy production is simply not going to meet a growing energy demand as we move to a more electronic world, from everything from vehicles to iPhones to higher computers that simply demand more and more energy over time.
So the irony, of course, with all of these government mandates is that, we found that the data bears out that they're just not as effective in their stated goal of lowering emissions. So given this, why, in your view, do you think liberals in Washington and Sacramento and other state capitals persist in clinging to this approach despite really mixed at best results? And what are some other better ways we could achieve our nation's clean energy goals without imposing these huge new burdens on small businesses and the working class?
Well, Tim, I think first of all, we have been successful in reducing our greenhouse gases. So we have made everything from coal to natural gas burn more efficiently and produce fewer emissions. The mere shift from traditional coal power plants to natural gas has been a huge boom for the environment because natural gas is a more efficient fuel that burns cleaner. And so what we've seen is, I think that the market has helped us achieve a cleaner environment because we've been able to go out and find alternative energy sources that produce cheaper energy with fewer emissions. And so, for example, here in Ohio, we might not have the sunny days that California has, but we do have shale and natural gas, and we've been able to get more efficient ways to extract that. So again, our emissions in Ohio have been falling. Our water is cleaner and our skies are cleaner as we shift to these newer energy sources that are able to burn more effectively than older energy sources such as coal. And so now what we're seeing is the government is saying, well, that's not good enough. We have to do it faster. And I think part of it has been I think there's some political incentives involved. It makes for snappy slogans, which becomes a problem when you're trying to implement these policies. Because again, given the amount of power plant building that has to be done, given the fact that some of these plans rely on plants that have not been built and technology that's not yet ready, it seems very far-fetched to achieve some of the goals that politicians want. So my first answer to your question is, let's continue to look at what's working, which is incentivizing companies through bonus depreciation so they can invest more, through lower taxes. And these companies will be able to invest more to look at alternative energy sources from wind, solar to natural gas to figure out what's competitive on the market. The second thing is, I think we have to get away from this idea that government subsidies are going to lead to more efficient and better economic outcomes. Government subsidies, in my view, distort markets. And so as a consequence, you have products that consumers don't want because there's no price signal, right? Like people aren't saying what they actually want and they're going to utilize. And, we saw data coming out that, the bill passed last year, energy subsidies are going to be 3 times expensive than was originally projected in just the course of a year. And so with the government throwing that much money, well, the cost of failure is being borne by taxpayers and not not businesses. So that is impeding some of the innovation that we've seen that has helped drive down prices of not just energy, but from a variety of goods. So, my concern is that the incentives of some of the current politicians are wrong, and that, it's much easier to get a picture snapped at a ribbon cutting ceremony at a new windmill plant, for example, than it is to sit there and say we need to have better fiscal policy to encourage companies to do more research and development to figure out how they can be more competitive by delivering a better product. And so, my second answer is, let's stop doubling down on bad policies and look at what's worked to reduce our carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases over the last 20 years, and continue to look at more efficient energy sources that deliver the best fuel at the best production for the environment. So everything should be on the table, and we need to move away from saying, hey, we need to get rid of these sources. We need to take a look again at nuclear, for example. Those are the types of innovations, I think, that'll continue to make the air cleaner, but without the massive cost increase we're seeing from the Biden administration.
It's interesting. You're talking about lack of innovation in terms of where we really need it, but where we are seeing innovation, and you touched upon this at the beginning of our podcast, is the administration is being very innovative in how they're trying to get this second attempt at the Clean Power Plan to remain on the books. And they're trying to avoid the Republican Congress from repealing the law. So I guess, what are some of the strategies that the Biden team is employing to try to make this new regulation stick this time? And does their approach open up the law for serious legal challenges, just like occurred last time?
They're doing a couple of different things. And I think one is, how do you eat an elephant? You eat it one bite at a time. And so instead of one big regulation and kind of one big energy plan, you're seeing, these smaller pieces. And the idea is if there's less of an economic impact by one regulation, that might not subject it to the same scrutiny from legal challenges, for example. So they might say, well, you can regulate up to this much. So the idea is, by breaking it apart, maybe some of the regulations avoid as much judicial scrutiny and tries to avoid precedent. I think that's a dubious assumption, but it's definitely something that they're looking at trying. The second thing is, we live in different states, so you have different policies. And, it's not just the Biden administration, but you're definitely seeing a push to try to implement the Clean Power Plan and versions of it at the state level, with the idea that these states will then pass it on to other states, if you will, a little spread. For example, if California mandates no more gas-powered cars, California is a big part of the U.S. economy. So you might have other car makers say, hey, to meet California standards, and we've seen that as a policy weapon being utilized by California and other states, where they're trying to enact this at the state level, get enough of a burden that businesses then just end up complying with that. And I think that's a real problem for those of us living in a federalist system. So it'll be interesting to see to what aspect a lot of the different governors are trying to build on their own clean power plans, complete with their own subsidies, complete with their own mandates, and to what extent they're successful in carrying out those policies in blue states. Conversely, kind of what we're seeing is, California, Illinois, New York are leading the nation in outbound migration. And, people are moving to opportunity. And so has some of those governors double down on these problematic policies, you'll make it faster for people to head to an Arizona, to a Texas, to a Florida.
So finally, we call our podcast Next Round because of PRI's proximity to wine country and our love of discussing public policy while enjoying a great glass of wine. So what wine, beer, cocktail, or other beverage are you enjoying these days to try and get the horrors of a second Clean Power Plan out of your mind?
Well, given what's coming up in my garden with spring coming on, I'm looking forward to more mint juleps, being able to grabbing mint out and then mixing it in with a nice bourbon over crushed ice with a little simple syrup. So it's a great spring cocktail as we get ready for summer and enjoying more sunny days and warmer climate here in Ohio.
Ray, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It has been quite a pleasure.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.